I'm going to talk about climate change. I'm not an ethicist, but I have been studying the public health implications of climate change for some years. And what I want to do today is to make the case that climate change poses some very serious ethical issues. And I hope that this will stimulate greater engagement by the bioethics community. So I don't think there's much doubt now that the climate is indeed warming. And this slide shows you the dark areas are where temperature has warmed over 1.5 degrees. The red areas where it's warmed around 0.8 to 0.1 degrees. And you can see that most of the world really has warmed very substantially since 1901. And in parallel with that, the sea level has been rising. As we warm the waters, sea level rises. And Arctic sea ice area has been declining, as you can see on the right side of this graph. So the evidence is now very strong that the climate is changing and that human activities are responsible. And this shows you how CO2 emissions have doubled. The most important greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, responsible for about 75+% of global warming. It's important because it stays up in the atmosphere for a long time. So every molecule of CO2 we put into the atmosphere stays up on average about 100 years. 20% will be there in 1,000 years' time. So we can't, at least with our current knowledge, easily bring those levels down. And you can see that the levels have been going up dramatically. And the thing I want to draw your attention to about this slide is that after 1970, the CO2 emissions have more than doubled compared with before 1970. So we're seeing an accelerated level of CO2 emissions. There are other greenhouse gases too. I don't have time to go into them except to say that methane is another important one. And that's rather a shorter period, half-life. There's also profound changes taking place in the regional patterns of greenhouse gas emissions. So they're shifting along with the changes in the world economy. So on the right-hand part of this slide, you can see the high-income countries, and their levels of emissions have almost peaked, really. They haven't changed very much. Then we're having the upper mid-income countries that are rising very, very rapidly. The lower middle-income countries are following them, and the poorest countries are still not rising very much. So those people are not benefiting very much from fossil fuel-powered development. So this immediately shows you that there are profound inequities which are only just beginning to be closed, and indeed, in the case of the poorest countries, they're not really narrowing. There are profound inequities in the amount of emissions and in the benefits that have resulted from those emissions, because our development pathways are dependent, of course, on the combustion of fossil fuels for our wealth and our development. So what will this mean? Well, this slide shows you what may happen if we don't reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. This is the line of relatively unmitigated, unreduced emissions. And you can see that this could very easily lead to 4 degrees warming. And that's an average warming. Over land, that will be even greater. So can you imagine, for example, what Central America or what Africa would look like if it was 5 or 6 degrees warmer? Well, that could happen by the end of the century, unless we do something very dramatic. And it's going to be very difficult for us to bring climate under control, as this particular line shows us. We would have to reduce emissions almost immediately. And of course, these changes won't just affect temperature, they'll also affect rainfall patterns. And this slide shows you how soil moisture will change. This is with a high emission of greenhouse gases, which is the line we're going on at the moment. And you can see that the blue areas where we get an increase in rainfall, and the red areas where we get a decrease. You can see, for example, much of Mexico, parts of the US, northern parts of South America, parts of Africa and the Mediterranean and Australia are all likely to suffer from reductions. So that means, in all probability, increased droughts, whereas in other parts of the world, there could be increased floods. At the moment, we have a limited window of trying to keep temperatures within 2 degrees warming. And that's a level which many climatologists think is a level beyond which we get into very dangerous possibilities of rapid climate change, rapid sea level rise, and so on. And we really only have about 255 billion tons of carbon left to emit if we want to have a reasonable chance of keeping within 2 degrees. And last year, we emitted about 10 billion tons. So this means that that carbon budget will essentially all be spent in about 25 years. So we have a very, very limited time to reduce our emissions down to a level which will keep us within 2 degrees. And we have to do that, as I will indicate, in a way which improves equity as far as possible. And so what I've told you already, I think, raises profound ethical questions. What is a just distribution of the burdens of mitigation? By mitigation, I mean reducing emissions. And it says in the UN Framework Climate Change Convention that the parties should protect the climate system on the basis of equity and with common but differentiated responsibilities based on historical emissions, of course. And what is a just distribution of rights to emit greenhouse gases? Should we move towards an equal per capita view, what's been called contraction and convergence? Should we acknowledge the fact that rich countries have benefited already from greenhouse gas emissions for their own development, and therefore they need to reduce even more than that? These are difficult and controversial questions, but they need to be faced. And we need to understand the ethical relevance of past emissions to both equitable burden sharing and to the just distribution of emission rights. Climate change, of course, can affect health in many, many ways, both direct and indirect, and some of them are summarized in this slide. I won't read them all out. Some of them are related to extreme weather events, some related to vector-borne diseases, water and food-borne diseases. Perhaps the most important is malnutrition. But the amount, it will depend on modulation, how much we develop, particularly poor countries develop, and how much we can adapt. In other words, either spontaneously or planned adaptation. Well, what sort of deaths might be caused by climate change? We have some estimates of deaths. Obviously, they're uncertain. This is taken from the World Health Organization. It's a cartogram which shows you in geographically proportionate way where the effects are experienced. And they estimated that perhaps 150,000 deaths a year are occurring by the year 2000 as a result of climate change, many due to malnutrition, but also other conditions, as you see here. And this cartogram just shows you how these deaths are experienced. And what's very striking, of course, is that if we had a similar map of greenhouse gas emissions, it would be almost the converse of that. So the countries which are emitting most will, at least in the near term, have the lowest health impacts. But of course, in the longer term, the whole world will be affected. There are many, many other effects of climate change. One of them is, of course, the inability to work. As the world gets hotter, it becomes more difficult to work, particularly outdoors. And this slide shows you the green areas, what we experience today. This is monthly minimum labor capacity. And you can see that for much of the world, there is a reduction to perhaps 60 or 70% as a result of thermal stress. But under climate change, with 3 degrees of global warming, much of the map becomes red, and that means that work capacity will be reduced to perhaps 10 or 20% of the labor capacity. So that means ruin for many of subsistence farmers. It means many poor people will not be able to work outdoors. They won't have air-conditioned tractors. They won't be living in air-conditioned houses. And so this is a profound ethical, public health, and economic challenge. We know that heat waves can cause excess deaths. The one in Europe in 2300 caused probably around 70,000. And we know that the probability of these heat waves will increase with climate change. And the bottom of this slide shows you the current temperature records. That was the 2003 one. And you can see that as it goes forward, the temperatures that seemed very extreme in 2003 will become the norm. In fact, they will even be exceeded as the century goes on, unless we radically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. 2010 was an extraordinary year. Was it a warning or a harbinger of things to come? There were 20 million people affected by floods in Pakistan, about 12 million in China. And of course, the Russian had profound fires. Over 50,000 people died in the heat wave around Moscow, and their wheat harvest was affected, so they stopped exporting, and food prices went up in many parts of the world. So it was a very big impact on health and development, and it's the kind of thing we might expect with climate change. Many millions more people are projected to be flooded as a result of sea level rise by the end of the century. And this map shows you where those populations are particularly large, the big red dots. So, for example, the Ganges, the Nile, the Mekong, and so on, the Mississippi, are all where very large numbers of people could be threatened by sea level rise. And very importantly, of course, the effect of climate change on malnutrition. And this slide just summarizes a whole range of different studies, which all tend to suggest that crop productivity, availability of food, therefore, will be reduced in many low-income countries. And you can see the red part of this slide is where we'll get reduction in yields, and the green part of the slide is where we might get increases. But even some of these increases might be only temporary. And if we look towards the end of the century, even in some of the high-income countries, we may start to see falls in crop production. And this doesn't include many other factors. They're not included in these climate models. So it could be worse than that. So this poses a very serious threat to food security. And remember, we already have 1 billion people suffering from food insecurity. So these slides, I think, raise the very important question of what is dangerous anthropogenic, in other words, human-induced interference with the climate system. This is important because this is what's in the UN Framework Climate Change Convention, which we are negotiating on, the world is negotiating on, and we have to come to an agreement by the end of 2015. I would submit that we already have good evidence that there is such dangerous interference, and we need to minimize that. What is a just response to risk and uncertainty? There will always be uncertainties. We can't be certain how many people will die in 100 years' time. But as the UNFCCC points out, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing such measures. But sadly, as we know, progress has been very, very slow. What are the physical, behavioral, and technological limits to how much we can adapt to climate change, and who should pay for that adaptation? Clearly, the onus should be on the countries that have benefited from the emissions of fossil fuels so far. And as this slide illustrates, there are a number of limits to how much we can actually adapt. Even in my own city, London, the Thames barrier will need to be replaced in the latter part of the century in order to deal with rising sea levels. And of course, small island states and some parts of coastal regions are already threatened. And so the IPCC, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its recent report in executive summary says that duties to pay for some climate change damages can be grounded in compensatory justice and distributive justice. And I think that's clear from some of the slides that I've already shown. But at the same time, there are important benefits from moving towards a low emission economy, a low greenhouse gas emission. And for a few years ago, we published a series of articles in The Lancet which documented and quantified these benefits in several sectors: housing, transport, food and agriculture, and electricity generation. I don't have time to go into our detailed findings, but they're in there in the peer-reviewed literature, and it's an area that we're continuing to work on. And what we find is that there are a whole range of benefits from moving towards a low-carbon economy over and above the benefit of preventing climate change. And one example, of course, is the reduction of air pollution. And WHO has recently estimated that about 3.7 million deaths a year are caused by ambient fine particles, and household air pollution from solid fuels, particularly poor people, causes about 4.3 million deaths a year. And so that adds to about 7 million total. You can't just add the two together because there's some overlap between them. But 7 million deaths a year, and many of those could be reduced if we could reduce the burning of coal, for example, and also provide clean energy to low-income households, and reduce the combustion of fuels, for example, diesel fuel. So this raises the important ethical question: should we prioritize mitigation policies, that's to say greenhouse gas reduction policies, on the basis of their healthcare benefits? And I would argue that in some cases that does make sense, because if we value these healthcare benefits, they can help to offset some of the costs of moving towards a low-carbon economy. Are there moral constraints on mitigation policies? So, for example, nuclear energy is controversial in many parts of the world, because there are low frequency, but if they happen, catastrophic effects. So how do we address those against the very real effects of climate change? And there are many other pros and cons of other low-carbon policies. Procedural justice: who has the right to be included in these decision-making processes around mitigation and adaptation? And so far, those people who are the most likely to suffer and are suffering from the effects of climate change are effectively often excluded from direct consultation. And what obligations do we, the current generation, have to future generations, both in terms of preventing dangerous climate change and distributing the cost of mitigation and adaptation? Shouldn't we, who have benefited so much from the current economy that we live in, be prepared to pay a little more in order to move towards a low-carbon economy? And in the UNFCCC treaty, it says that the parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind on the basis of equity. So why aren't we moving forward? Well, it's a complicated question. There are many answers to it. There are a whole range of barriers to policy change. One is vested interest. The fossil fuel industries are very powerful. There is an organized denialism in some countries, and there's a brilliant book, which I would recommend to those of you who are interested, called Merchants of Doubt, by American historians Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. And they show that there is a small group of people who have, supported by very powerful interests, what they call obscured the truth on issues from tobacco smoke to global warming over many decades. So what they suggest is it's the same kind of interests that are working to obstruct movement on climate change. And of course, many of our political leaders have very short-term perspectives. They're interested in the next election, not in future generations, or even 20 or 30 years down the line. And of course, we have a divided and often confused public. And I think there's still a lack of awareness and knowledge about climate change. And perhaps people think that there are more doubts about climate change than there really are. There are some doubts, but the broad science is pretty clear. And finally, there's a perception that change is very expensive and difficult. And the IPCC, again, the UN Intergovernmental Panel, in its most recent report, has shown that actually, if we can mobilize the full range of technologies that we have now and technologies we could have in the future, the extra costs really are very small, and they have to be set against a rapidly growing world economy. And of course, if we carry on without reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that economic growth, particularly towards the end of the century, is really under threat. So I believe that there are overwhelming reasons to move now. And in conclusion, what I would like to say is that climate change does have far-reaching and potentially catastrophic impacts on health, despite the uncertainties. But many of these low-carbon policies in, for example, energy, in transport, food and agriculture, housing, can actually improve health. And they can improve the economy as well. And I think the challenge for our generation is to try to avoid that catastrophic scenario. As this report from the World Bank says, we've got to turn down the heat. We've got to avoid that 4-degree future, because that will be intensely damaging for our children, our grandchildren's generation, and future generations. And we have it within our hands to actually dramatically reduce the chance of catastrophic effects. So I hope that I've convinced you in the ethics community that this is a serious ethical challenge, that we in the public health and the climate change communities need your support and your analysis to advance our knowledge, advance our ethical analysis and understanding of this key topic for the future of humanity. Thank you very much.